They laughed when they first heard about it, not openly, not in the way soldiers laugh at a joke in the barracks, but quietly, through tight grins and glances passed over metal cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. They called it the no-name plan. No designation, no official stamp, no fancy briefing from the brass. Just an order scribbled on a grease-stained page. Advance east through the forest, create confusion, lure the enemy toward the river. I remember standing in that dim tent, the lamplight flickering against the canvas, and feeling like I'd just been handed a death sentence wrapped in optimism. Nobody wanted to lead it. Nobody wanted to even talk about it. But I'd already been passed over too many times, told I didn't fit the mold of a proper officer. I was too quiet, too straightforward, too unrefined for their taste. So when the colonel asked for a volunteer, I raised my hand, not out of bravery, but out of a kind of exhausted defiance. They could call us no name, but at least the failure, when it came, would be mine. That night, I walked among the men as they packed their gear. It was cold, the kind of cold that cuts through every layer and settles in your bones. The ground was half-frozen mud, and the air carried that sharp metallic scent that always came before snow. We didn't speak much. You learn after a while that silence says more than words ever can. Private Ellis sat on his pack, cleaning his rifle by the glow of a lantern. He looked young, even under all the grime, barely 20. "Sir," he said, "you think this plan's worth a damn?" I told him plans are worth exactly as much as the men following them. He nodded like he understood, but his eyes betrayed the fear gnawing at him. I recognized it because I felt it too. You never stop being afraid out there. You just learn to carry it like an extra piece of equipment, heavier than your pack, more reliable than your compass. The no-name platoon wasn't much to look at. We were a mix of leftovers, farm boys from Iowa, dock workers from Boston, a mechanic from Detroit who'd lied about his age, and a Cherokee scout who spoke little but saw everything. We didn't have matching uniform. Some wore torn jackets. Others wrapped their feet in rags because their boots had given out weeks ago. Our radio crackled more than it transmitted, and our rations had been cut in half to feed the men on the front line. But for all that, there was something in us, a strange, stubborn fire that made up for what we lacked in pride. Maybe it was the fact that nobody expected us to come back. Maybe that freedom, that absence of expectation, gave us a kind of power. I lay awake most of that night, listening to the low murmur of voices and the distant rumble of artillery. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that swallowed the moon whole. I thought about home, though I didn't really have one anymore. Before the war, I'd worked on the railroads, fixing lines through the Midwest. I remembered the sound of trains cutting through fog, the whistle echoing through cornfields. Simple things that now felt like pieces of another man's life. War doesn't just take your future, it steals your past and replaces it with noise. Every memory gets rewritten by the sound of gunfire, by the faces of men you couldn't save. We moved out before dawn. The world was quiet in that strange way it gets just before sunrise, when the sky begins to pale, but the light hasn't yet touched the earth. Frost clung to every branch, every blade of grass, glittering faintly in the dim light. Our breath came out in plumes, white ghosts drifting through the trees. The forest around us was dense, almost suffocating. Every crack of a twig, every distant echo felt like it might be our last. The fog rolled low, hugging the ground, and the trees loomed like sentinels from another world. I could barely see the man in front of me, just the faint outline of his helmet moving through the mist. Command had told us the German division was stretched thin, that they wouldn't expect resistance in that sector. But I'd learned by then that intelligence reports were little more than wishful thinking printed on fancy paper. The truth was, we were walking into the unknown, armed with little more than hope and the illusion of strategy. Still, as I looked at my men trudging through the frost, something in me hardened. Maybe it was pride, or maybe just the refusal to die as a joke. If the world wanted to laugh at our no-name plan, then we'd make sure it ended with a story worth telling. I remember glancing at Ellis again. His hands were trembling slightly on the stock of his rifle. I thought of saying something to calm him, but I didn't. Words can't fix fear, only movement can. So I kept walking, leading them through that endless forest, one cautious step at a time. Every mile we moved, the silence grew heavier. The sun never fully broke through the clouds, and by midday, the world seemed trapped in a grey half-light. That's when I first felt it, that invisible weight pressing down on us, the sense that we weren't alone anymore. The forest had gone too still. Even the birds had vanished. I raised my hand, signaling the men to stop, and for a moment, the entire world held its breath. The laughter of those who doubted us still echoed somewhere in my mind, distant and hollow. Maybe it was that memory that kept me steady, because as I stared into that fog, heart pounding, I realized that this no-name plan wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a test of faith, of will, of the kind of courage that doesn't come from orders, but from necessity. And I intended to pass it, no matter how many ghosts it took. If you're still with me, tell me where you're watching this from. I want to know where this story reaches you tonight, because sometimes the only thing that keeps the past alive is someone willing to listen. By the time the sun began to break through the fog, our boots were soaked through and our hands had gone numb. We hadn't spoken in hours, not because I'd ordered silence, but because we all knew that words would only remind us how far we still had to go. The forest thinned just enough for the light to touch the frost-covered ground, revealing the narrow valley that stretched ahead. According to the map, the river lay beyond that ridge. That's where the diversion was supposed to happen, where we'd make enough noise to convince the enemy that a full assault was underway. But as I looked across the terrain, something in my gut twisted. It was too quiet, too open. No birds, no wind, just that low hum that only the living silence of war can carry. We dug in along a shallow slope, setting up what little equipment we had. The radio operator, Jenkins, fought with the static for nearly half an hour before he could get a clear signal through to command. The voice on the other end was faint and impatient. They wanted us to move faster, to trigger the distraction so the main force could advance. I told them the terrain wasn't right, that we were too exposed, that the fog was lifting. They said the plan didn't depend on comfort, only on timing. Then the signal died, leaving us with nothing but the echo of their urgency. I remember staring at that radio set, the cold metal pressing against my fingers, and thinking how absurd it was that our lives depended on a machine that could barely speak. Ellis came up beside me, his face pale under the grime. "Sir," he said, "what if they're already watching us?" I looked out at the tree line, the grey blur of branch, the ghostly shimmer of frost, and said, "Then they're taking their time. That means we've still got some." He nodded, but I could tell it didn't help much. Fear doesn't leave a man's face easily once it's set in. Still, I had to look steady. That's what leadership becomes after all. Not about knowing, but pretending to. You keep your back straight and your eyes forward, and you pray the men behind you don't notice how much your hands are shaking. We waited until the sun climbed higher, until the fog thinned enough to show us the ridgeline. I ordered the men to set up dummy positions, logs dressed in spare uniforms, helmets placed atop rifle, the illusion of a larger force. It was crude, but effective. We built fake foxholes, planted decoy wires, anything that could make a German scout think twice. The men moved with a strange energy, not courage exactly, but the nervous momentum that comes when fear finds something to do. I watched them work and realized how much they'd changed in just a few weeks. These weren't the same boys who joked about home and girls back in England. The war had burned all that softness out of them, replaced it with something harder, quieter. By midday, the first sounds came, distant at first, then sharper, engine noise, faint, but unmistakable. I raised my binoculars and scanned the far ridge. Movement, dark shapes gliding between the trees. My throat tightened. They were there. A full German reconnaissance unit, maybe more. I could see the glint of their helmets, the methodical way they moved, not charging, not careless, cautious, deliberate. They knew something was wrong. I dropped the binoculars and turned to the men. "Positions!" I hissed. They moved fast, sliding into the shallow trenches, rifles ready. The forest seemed to shrink around us, every branch and leaf turning into a possible threat. Minutes dragged like hours. The sound of engines grew louder, then stopped. Silence again, the kind that sets your teeth on edge. Jenkins looked at me, whispering, "Do we start the fire?" Meaning the signal shot, the noise that would draw attention. But I hesitated. Something about this didn't fit. The Germans weren't rushing. They were waiting too. Maybe they were testing us, trying to see if we'd flinch first. I told him to hold. We'd wait until we were sure they'd seen our setup. The tension was unbearable. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my ears. Then it happened. A single rifle crack split the air. One of our dummies' helmets flew off, spinning into the snow. The shot came from somewhere in the trees. A second shot followed, closer this time. And then, as if the forest had decided to wake all at once, the whole ridge erupted in gunfire. Bark exploded from trees, dirt flew into our faces, and the sound, that horrible, endless sound, swallowed everything else. We hit the ground, returning fire blindly, just to stay alive. I shouted for the men to hold their positions, to stick to the plan, but the words barely reached my own ears over the chaos. It went on for what felt like hours. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and pinned down. Every few seconds, someone would yell for a medic, and every time the answer was silence. At one point, I crawled over to Ellis, who was clutching his arm, blood soaking through his sleeve. He tried to smile, said it was just a scratch. It wasn't. I tore a strip from my own sleeve and tied it around the wound, my hands slick with cold blood. He looked up at me and said, "Guess they stopped laughing." And even in that moment, I couldn't help but let out a short, bitter laugh. He was right. No one was laughing anymore. Eventually, the gunfire slowed. The Germans must have realized we weren't the army they thought we were. Maybe they believed they'd wiped us out. They pulled back, vanishing into the mist as quickly as they'd come. When the silence finally returned, it wasn't relief I felt. It was something heavier, something like dread, because now they knew they'd be back, and next time, they wouldn't come probing. They'd come to finish it. I walked through the trees, checking the men. 7 were dead, 5 wounded. Jenkins was gone. The radio shattered beside him. I remember kneeling there, staring at that broken radio, and realizing that command wouldn't even know we were still alive. The no-name plan had become a ghost mission, lost in the noise of a war too big to care about us. And yet somehow, in that grey clearing filled with the smell of gunpowder and frozen blood, I felt something shift inside me. We had survived the first strike, barely, but enough. Enough to prove that the no-name platoon wasn't just another expendable unit. We were still breathing, and that meant the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. If you've made it this far, hit that subscribe button, because the next part, when we turn that disaster into the trap that broke their line, that's where the real story begins. The hours after that firefight blurred into something between nightmare and exhaustion. We buried our dead shallow, because the ground was too hard to dig deep. Frost bit through our gloves and into the skin, turning our fingers numb as we worked. I didn't let the men talk while we did it. Talking made it real. We laid Jenkins down with his radio beside him, useless now, a broken box full of static and silence. I remember brushing snow off his face and thinking how he'd spent his last breath trying to reach someone who'd never even known his name. The world kept moving while good men died, quiet deaths in the woods. That truth sat heavy on my chest, heavier than any pack I'd ever carried. When the last grave was covered, I gathered what was left of the platoon. 18 of us now, faces pale, eyes hollow, uniforms stiff with blood and frost. They looked to me not for orders, but for something else, a reason. That's the thing they don't tell you about command. Orders are easy. Reasons are what get men killed or keep them alive. I looked at them and said the only thing I truly believed. They think we're dead, so let's make that mistake cost them. That sentence, simple as it was, lit something in their faces. It wasn't hope exactly, more like anger sharpened into purpose. We couldn't reach command, couldn't call for support, and couldn't retreat without walking straight into the enemy's jaws. So the only way left was forward, through the forest, across the frozen river, behind their own line. The plan formed itself in my head as I spoke it. If the Germans thought they'd wiped us out, they'd pull their units toward the West Ridge to secure the area. That left their eastern flank, the one running parallel to the river, stretched and underguarded. If we could move silently and fast, we could cut through, set charges on the supply route, and create a disruption big enough to make them think a full division was encircling them. It was madness, the kind of plan only desperation breeds. But the men didn't flinch. They were past the point of fear. When death is already sitting beside you, it's easy to look him in the eye and say, "Wait your turn." We moved at dusk. The forest was a graveyard of frozen branches and forgotten shells. Every step had to be measured, every breath muffled. The snow had begun to fall, light, soft, almost gentle, covering the footprints of the dead. I took point, rifle low, eyes scanning for movement. The river was half a mile ahead, and beyond it, the faint glow of enemy fires flickered like candles in the distance. The Germans had set up camp on the high ground, confident that nothing living remained between them and safety. That confidence would be their mistake. Halfway there, we came across the remains of a convoy, 2 burned-out jeeps, a scattered crate of ammunition, and a body still half-strapped into the driver's seat. The insignia marked him as one of ours. His face was frozen mid-expression, eyes open toward the sky. I crouched beside him, pulled a half-burnt letter from his jacket pocket, and saw that it was addressed to someone named Mary. I didn't read it, I just tucked it back and closed his eyes. War teaches you to stop asking questions about strangers. You just make sure they're not left staring. We salvaged what we could: ammo, a few grenades, a map smeared with mud, then kept moving. The snow was thicker now, clinging to our sleeves, softening the world into silence. That's when I saw the tracks. Boot prints leading away from the road, fresh, moving parallel to ours. I raised my fist, signaling the men to stop. We crouched low, the world suddenly shrinking into that narrow tunnel of instinct and heartbeat. I followed the tracks with my eyes until I saw them, 4 figures, faint through the snowfall, moving cautiously along the ridge. Germans, scouts, probably sent to confirm our destruction. I motioned to Ellis and Corporal Donnelly. We crawled through the brush, slow and low, until we were less than 30 feet away. The wind was in our favor. I could hear them murmuring in German, one of them laughing. That sound, that easy laugh, cut through me like a blade. How quickly men learn to joke over the dead. I raised my rifle, waited for the rhythm of my heartbeat to steady, then squeezed the trigger. The first one dropped instantly. The second turned, shouting, but Ellis took him through the chest before he could raise his weapon. The others bolted into the trees, and Donnelly's burst cut them down before they vanished. The entire fight lasted less than 15 seconds, but the echoes seemed to hang forever. We dragged the bodies off the trail. One of them still had a map case slung over his shoulder. Inside was a rough layout of their local defense line, trenches near the river, 2 mortar pits, and an ammo dump just east of their command post. I looked it over under the dim light of a covered lantern, and a thought crept through my mind like a spark catching kindling. This was it. This was how we'd turn our no-name plan into a legend. If we could hit that ammo dump and make it look like a coordinated strike, the Germans would panic. They'd believe a much larger force had cut off their supply route, and in their confusion, our main division, the one we were supposed to be supporting, would get the opening they needed. The men stared at me while I explained it. No one argued. There wasn't anything left to argue about. We were ghosts now, and ghosts don't retreat. We crossed the river that night under a thin sheet of moonlight, the ice cracking beneath our boots like bones snapping. The water underneath was black and slow, whispering like a secret. I remember the sting of cold creeping through my legs, the weight of the rifle over my shoulder, the faint sound of Ellis's breathing behind me. We moved like shadows, each man trusting the one ahead of him not to falter. When we reached the far bank, we collapsed against the frozen ground, gasping, shaking, half alive. But we were there, behind enemy lines, invisible. From that point on, time lost all meaning. The forest, the snow, the darkness, it all melted into a single unbroken moment. We moved in silence, speaking only with gestures, listening for the faintest rustle that wasn't our own. I could feel the plan taking shape with every step, a rhythm of movement and patience. We'd become the thing they feared most, the unseen. Every crunch of snow beneath our boots sounded like destiny turning its gears. As we crept closer to the enemy camp, I could see the glow of their fires reflecting off the low clouds, the shadows of men moving around barrels and tents. I counted at least 40, maybe more. Too many for a direct attack, but we didn't need to attack. We needed to convince. We placed what little explosives we had around the perimeter of the ammo dump, rigging grenades with wires, setting charges near the fuel drums. The men worked with quiet precision, hands steady despite the cold. I could see the steam of their breath rising like ghosts returning home. When the last wire was set, I gathered them close. No matter what happens, I said, we don't stop until the fire spreads. Once it does, we pull back to the ridge. If you hear me shout, you run, not before. They nodded. There was no fear left in their eyes, only that hollow calm that comes when men have already made peace with dying. I took one last look at the camp, then at my watch. 03:17. The perfect hour for ghosts to make themselves known. I pulled the pin on the first grenade and whispered, "For Jenkins." The explosion tore through the night like thunder cracking open the sky. Flames roared to life, swallowing the ammo dump, igniting fuel drums that sent fireballs shooting into the dark. The ground shook. The air split with screams and shouts in German. I shouted for the men to move, and we scattered through the chaos, rifles spitting light as we ran. Behind us, the camp was an inferno. Shadows running, alarms blaring, confusion spreading like wildfire. It was working. God help me. It was actually working. We reached the ridge as the sky began to glow red with fire. I looked back and saw what we'd done. The no-name platoon had become an army in the enemy's eyes. They were calling for reinforcements, shifting their lines, retreating toward the west. Just like I'd hoped, the trap was forming, and they didn't even know it yet. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. By dawn, the whole valley was burning. From the ridge, we could see the fire consuming their camp. smoke curling upward in thick black ribbons that stained the sky. The explosions came one after another, rolling across the forest like thunder trapped in the trees. I remember the heat on my face even from that distance, the faint metallic taste of smoke in the back of my throat. Below, the Germans were shouting, running in every direction, their vehicles colliding in panic as they tried to regroup. We'd done it. Our little phantom unit had set chaos loose on a division. But what the hell do you do once you realize your madness worked? That's the question nobody prepares you for. We couldn't celebrate. Not yet. I knew what would come next. A force that size doesn't collapse quietly. They'd call for reinforcements, reposition their armor, send scouts into the woods to find whoever did this. The key was timing. The main division, miles to the west, was supposed to advance once they saw the smoke. If they moved fast enough, they'd hit the Germans mid-retreat. But we had no radio, no way to confirm they'd even gotten the signal. So all we could do was keep the fire alive, keep them confused, keep them moving in the wrong direction. We split into pairs, moving through the forest like ghosts. The snow was melting near the fires, turning the ground to mud and ash. Every few minutes, we'd hear bursts of gunfire echoing in the distance, not at us, but blind shots into the dark. They were chasing shadows now. That's when I realized the power of fear. You don't need to outnumber the enemy if you can make him see you everywhere. I told Ellis to take Donnelly and head north, keep them guessing. I led the others east, toward the river bend where the terrain dipped into a shallow ravine. If the Germans sent armor through there, we could bottleneck them. It was reckless, stupid even, but recklessness is sometimes the only language war understands. We found cover among the rocks just as the first patrol came through. 4 half-tracks, headlights cutting through the smoke, their engines growling like beasts. The men crouched low, rifles steady, waiting for my signal. My hand trembled slightly as I raised it, not from fear, but from the cold biting deep into my bones. When the first vehicle rolled over the ridge, I pulled the pin on a grenade and counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3, then let it fly. The explosion tore the lead half-track apart, flipping it sideways, flames spilling across the road. The others screeched to a halt, men shouting in German, scrambling for cover. We opened fire, the air filled with chaos, bullets snapping through branches, ricocheting off rocks, men yelling in the dark. I remember the flash of muzzle fire lighting Ellis's face, the grim focus in his eyes. We were outnumbered, but we had the high ground, and the smoke from the burning wreck made it almost impossible for them to see us. We hit them again and again, forcing them to retreat toward the main road. For every one of us, there were 10 of them, but they didn't know that. All they saw was fire from the hills and shadows in the trees. By the time the shooting stopped, 2 of our men were down, and a dozen Germans lay scattered on the frozen ground below. Ellis crawled over beside me, breathing hard. "You think they'll fall for it?" he asked. I looked out over the smoke, where the rest of their forces were still struggling to form a line. "They already have," I said, and I meant it. You could see it in their movements, confusion spreading like a sickness. They were shifting west, abandoning their supply line, trying to regroup against an enemy that didn't exist. That was when I realized we'd done more than survive. We'd changed the direction of a battle without even meaning to. But victories in war come at a price, always. As we regrouped near the river, Donnelly limped toward us, blood seeping through his trouser leg. A sniper had grazed him. He gritted his teeth, waved off help, and kept walking. The man was built from steel and stubbornness. We rested for barely an hour, just long enough to catch our breath. Then the sound came, distant, faint, but unmistakable. Artillery. The Germans were firing blind into the forest, pounding the hills where they thought we were hiding. The ground shook beneath us, trees splintering, snow and dirt raining from above. The men dove for cover, curling into the earth like frightened animals. The world turned into a storm of sound and light, each blast a hammer blow to the soul. I remember lying there, face pressed into the frozen mud, the earth trembling against my chest. The sky above was orange and black, glowing from the fires we'd started hours ago. I thought of home then, not as a place, but as a sound, the whistle of a train, the laughter of my brother before, the soft creak of my mother's porch, steps at night, things that felt like they belonged to another lifetime. The blasts kept coming, closer each time, and I started to wonder if maybe this was how it ended. Not in a charge, not in a blaze of glory, but buried alive under the same dirt we fought over. Then, as suddenly as it started, the shelling stopped. The silence afterward was almost worse. A hollow, ringing silence that pressed on the ears. I lifted my head, coughing, dirt in my teeth. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burned wood. Around me, the men stirred, dazed, but alive. Somehow, miraculously, we'd made it through again. But when I looked at Ellis, I saw the fear in his eyes had been replaced by something else, a kind of numbness, the kind that settles into a man when he's seen too much and expects to see more. We moved again before the Germans could reload, south this time, skirting the edge of the forest. I could feel the exhaustion dragging at my limbs, every muscle screaming for rest. But rest didn't exist out there, only distance, only survival. As we climbed a narrow ridge overlooking the valley, I saw movement far to the west, flashes of light, the distant echo of heavy gunfire. My heart kicked in my chest. It had to be them, our division. The signal had worked. The main assault had begun. The trap was closing. I turned to the men and pointed toward the valley. "That's our boys," I said. "They're hitting them head on. We just have to keep them pinned here." Their faces lit with something I hadn't seen in days. Not joy, but purpose. A reason again. We took positions along the ridge, rifles steady, waiting for the next wave. When it came, it was chaos incarnate. Trucks, infantry, armor, all moving in panic. The Germans had realized too late that they'd been drawn into a noose. We fired into the confusion, each shot a punctuation in the madness. The noise was deafening. The overlapping thunder of artillery, the crack of rifle, the shouts of men who didn't know which way to run. By mid-morning, it was over. The valley that had burned before now lay silent, littered with the wreckage of what had been a proud and disciplined enemy division. The smoke rose in thin grey columns, drifting lazily into the sky. I stood there, rifle hanging from my shoulder, and felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, just the heavy stillness that comes after the storm. The men gathered around me, too tired to speak. We'd done it. The no-name platoon had turned a suicide mission into a victory. But as I looked at the faces around me, fewer now, older somehow, I knew we'd left pieces of ourselves in that valley that would never come back. Later, when the main force finally reached us, they couldn't believe what they found. "You did this?" one of the captains asked, staring at the destroyed convoy. The bodies, the fires still smouldering. I didn't answer. What was there to say? We hadn't done it for glory. We'd done it because we had no other choice. Because sometimes survival is the only strategy that works. Now, when I close my eyes, I can still see that fire, the way it moved through the valley, unstoppable, merciless, beautiful in a terrible way. It burned everything, even the laughter of those who once doubted us. Tell me something. If you'd been there, with us in that freezing dawn, would you have fought or run? Comment that below. Write, "I would have stayed." Let's see who would have stood their ground in that valley with us. When the smoke finally thinned and the sound of gunfire disappeared into the distance, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the world had stopped breathing. The snow had turned grey with ash, and the air carried that sharp metallic tang of spent shells and burnt oil. The valley below us was unrecognizable, a graveyard of twisted metal, broken trees, and men who would never wake again. I remember standing there, staring at it, and feeling nothing at first, just emptiness, the kind that sinks deep, like a weight pressing behind the ribs. They say war hardens you, but that's a lie. It doesn't harden, it hollows. It scoops out everything soft inside and fills it with. The men were scattered among the rocks, catching their breath, faces streaked with soot and tears they didn't realize had fallen. Donnelly was sitting with his back against a tree, his wounded leg stretched out, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. Ellis sat beside him, silent, his eyes locked on the horizon. Nobody spoke. There was nothing left to say. Words were for the living, and we weren't sure we still qualified. I dropped to my knees beside the ridge and watched the last of the fire die out, the smoke rising like ghosts climbing back to the sky. For a brief second, I thought about all the men we'd buried in shallow graves, Jenkins and the others, whose names I still whisper some nights when sleep refuses to come. I wondered if they'd forgive me for making decisions that got them killed, for leading them into a plan that was never supposed to work, for surviving when they didn't. Around midday, a runner from the main division reached us, a kid, barely 19, with dirt on his face and disbelief in his eyes. He looked at our tattered uniform, our makeshift camp, the blackened valley below, and said, "Command thought you were gone." I told him we almost were. He handed me a note scrawled on damp paper. "Enemy line broken. Division advancing east. Hold position. Hold position." As if we had anything left to hold. I crumpled the note and shoved it into my pocket. We'd done what no one thought possible, but even in triumph, the orders never stopped. The machine of war doesn't pause to mourn. It just grinds forward, feeding on whoever's left standing. As night fell, the temperature dropped fast. We built a small fire under a half-collapsed tarp, careful to keep the light low. The flickering glow carved shadows across the men's faces. making them look older than they were. I passed around a flask of brandy I'd taken from a German officer's body, the kind of drink too fine for a place like that. One by one, the men took a sip, not to celebrate, but to remember, to keep the cold from settling too deep into the soul. Ellis broke the silence first. "Sir," he said quietly, "you think they'll ever know it was us?" I looked at him and saw something in his eyes I recognized, that need to believe it meant something, that it wasn't just random survival. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe they will, but that's not why we did it." He nodded slowly, though I don't think either of us believed the. Later that night, when most of the men were asleep, I walked down to the river. The moonlight stretched across the water, silver and cold. The current was slow, dragging pieces of debris from the battle downstream. A helmet, a splintered rifle stock, the shattered remains of what had once been someone's campfire. I crouched by the edge and washed the grime from my hands. The blood didn't come off easily. It never does. I caught my reflection in the dark water and barely recognized the man staring back. There were lines on my face I didn't remember earning, eyes that looked older than they should. For the first time in a long while, I felt the weight of every decision I'd made pressing down on me. Leadership, I realized, wasn't about bravery or tactic. It was about carrying ghosts, all of them, and never letting anyone see how heavy they were. The forest was quiet, except for the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled. I thought about home again, though the word had lost its meaning. What was home to a man who'd seen the world burn? It wasn't a place anymore. It was a sound, a smell, a fragment of memory that you carried like a photograph in your pocket. For me, it was the scent of rain on dry rails, the rhythm of boots on gravel, the way the morning light used to spill through the window of my father's workshop. Things I'd thought I'd see again someday. But after that valley, I knew that part of me had been buried there, alongside Jenkins, alongside the laughter that used to live somewhere behind my ribs. When I went back to camp, Ellis was still awake, staring at the fire. He looked up as I sat beside him. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "What happens now?" I poked at the embers with a stick, watching the sparks drift into the dark. "Now?" I said. "Now we wait for the next order. There's always another one." He was quiet for a long time before saying, "Feels like the world should have stopped." I nodded, because I'd thought the same thing too. How could everything keep going after them? How could the earth still turn, the sun still rise, after what we'd done and what we'd lost? But war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It just changes shape. It moves into your head, your heart, your dreams. It follows you home and sits at your table. It becomes a shadow that never leaves. I lay down beside the fire and listened to the steady breathing of the men. Each one of them carried his own private war now. Each one had seen something that would wake him years later in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, wondering if he was still there, back in that valley, surrounded by smoke and ghosts. I closed my eyes and prayed, not anymore, but for memory, because forgetting would have felt like another kind of death. The next morning, when the sun rose pale and weak through the trees, I stood and looked out across the valley one last time. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and slow, covering the scars of the battle, hiding the bodies, smoothing over the wreckage. Nature has a way of pretending nothing ever happened, but I knew better. Beneath that white silence lay everything we'd lost, everything we'd become. I turned away before it could bury me too. Years later, when people ask me about the war, I never tell them about the valley first. I talk about the cold, the mud, the waiting. I tell them about the smell of coffee in a tin cup, the sound of boots on frozen earth, the way silence could stretch so thin it made your heart ache, because those are the things that stay with you long after the noise fades. The battles, the explosions, the chaos, they all blur together after a while, but the small things, the quiet moments between the madness, they cling to you like ghosts that refuse to leave. I came home in 45 with a chest full of ribbons and a head full of noise. They said we were heroes. They said we'd saved lives, turned the tide, changed history. I shook hands, smiled for the photograph, and let them pin their praise on me like it meant something. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who'd lost too much to ever be whole again. The war followed me home. It hid in the corners of quiet rooms, in the gaps between my wife's questions, in the spaces where laughter should have been. Nights were the worst. The sound of rain would bring it back, the hiss of shrapnel, the smell of smoke, the faces of men whose names I still whispered into the dark. You don't leave a place like that behind. You just learn to live beside it. Ellis came home too, though not for long. He couldn't find work, couldn't find peace. He used to visit me sometime, sitting on the porch with a cigarette, staring at the horizon, like he was still looking for something out there. One night, he told me he still heard Jenkins on the radio. in his dreams, calling for command, voice fading in and out of the static. I told him I heard it too sometime. We sat there in silence for a long time after that. He didn't come by much after. A few years later, I got a letter from his sister saying he'd gone out hunting one morning and never came back. They said it was an accident. I knew better. The war doesn't kill you all at once. It takes its time. I tried to move on. Got a job with the railroads again. The same tracks, the same whistle cutting through the fog. For a while, it felt like maybe I'd found something solid again. But every time I saw the steam rise off the engine, I thought of the smoke rising from that valley. Every clang of metal sounded like gunfire. Every long stretch of quiet track looked like a road leading back into those woods. My wife used to ask me what I was thinking when I'd drift off at the table. I'd tell her nothing, because how do you tell someone that part of you never left another world entirely? I started writing after she passed, not for anyone to read, just to empty the noise onto paper. I'd sit by the window with a cup of coffee gone cold and let the words spill out, one memory at a time. The smell of diesel in the air before dawn, the way Ellis's hands shook when he loaded his rifle, the echo of our laughter the night before everything went wrong. I wrote because remembering hurt, but forgetting felt worse. Some nights, I'd fall asleep with the pages scattered across the floor, dreaming of the men I'd buried and the fire we'd lit in that nameless valley. Sometimes, kids from the neighborhood would come by, asking about the medals hanging in my study. They'd point at them, eyes wide, full of the kind of wonder only the young can have for something they don't understand. "Did you win these?" they'd ask. I'd tell them no. "These," I'd say, "belong to the men who didn't come home." They'd nod, not really getting it, and run off to play. But it felt right to say it, because every medal, every piece of shining brass, is just a headstone you wear on your chest. Now, the world has moved on. The places where we fought are quiet again, covered in grass and sunlight. Tourists walk the trails where we once crawled through mud and blood. They take pictures, smile, and leave footprints that vanish with the next rain. Sometimes I envy them, their distance, their ignorance. But part of me is glad the land forgot. Someone should. The earth deserves peace, even if we don't. I visit Jenkins's grave once a year, a small plot under a crooked oak in a cemetery nobody tends much anymore. The name's barely visible on the stone now, worn down by rain and time. I bring him a cup of black coffee. He used to drink it so strong it could strip paint, and I sit there a while, talking to the air. I tell him about the trains still running, about how quiet the nights are now, about how Ellis finally found his rest. Sometimes I imagine he answers back, his voice crackling through the wind like it used to through the static, and for a moment, the years don't feel so long. People think war ends when the guns stop, but I know better. It just changes its uniform. It marches home with you, sits beside your bed, watches you age. It waits for you in the spaces between heartbeats. And sometimes, when the night's too quiet, it reminds you who you were and what you'll never be again. I used to think the hardest part of war was surviving it. I was wrong. The hardest part is learning how to keep living after you have. There's a kind of silence that follows men like me. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of understanding. You stop talking because you know words will never be enough. You learn to smile when people thank you for your service, nod when they call you a hero, and say, "It was nothing," because if you told them what it really was, they'd look away. Nobody wants to hear how courage smells like fear and blood mixed with wet earth. Nobody wants to know that most of the time, you're not fighting for freedom. You're fighting to get one more man home. I live alone now. The house is small, just enough space for one man and a lifetime of memories that never learned how to fade. The walls creak in the winter, and sometimes the wind outside sounds like the whistle of incoming shells. I keep the window cracked open at night, no matter how cold it gets. It helps me breathe. Sometimes I wake before dawn, make coffee the way we used to in camp, thick, bitter, the way Jenkins liked it. I sit at the table and stare out at the dark until the first light breaks over the trees. That's when I talk to them, the ones who didn't come back. Not out loud, not always, but quietly, in the part of my mind that still belongs to the war. I tell them the world's still turning, that people still laugh, that their names haven't been forgotten, not by me anyway. I've kept one thing all these years, a small piece of shrapnel, no bigger than a coin. It came from that last day in the valley, lodged in my pack. The medic pulled it out later and told me I was lucky. I didn't feel lucky then. I keep it on my desk now, beside the medals I never asked for. Some nights I pick it up and roll it between my fingers. It's cold, heavy, and real. Proof that it all happened, that the ghosts weren't just stories. When people visit and see it, they always ask why I still have it. I tell them it's a reminder, not of pain, but of cost. Every victory leaves a debt that someone has to live long enough to remember. I guess that's what I've been doing all these years, paying the balance. I never remarried after the war. The woman I loved said she couldn't reach me anymore, and she was right. The man who came home wasn't the one who'd left. I didn't blame her. I still don't. I've seen too much emptiness to ask anyone else to live beside it. But sometimes, when the sun sets just right, and the air smells like rain on iron, I remember her face, her laughter, the softness in her eyes, and for a heartbeat, I feel human again. Then the memory passes. Like everything else, I'm old now. The war lives farther away each day, though it never really leaves. It lingers at the edge of things, in the sound of a train, in the flicker of a candle, in the way the morning light hits the frost. People tell me it's important to move on, but they don't understand that for men like me, moving on means letting go of the only proof we ever existed as more than shadows. So I keep the memories close, I keep the names close, and when I tell the story, I tell it not for me, but for them, for Ellis, for Jenkins, for the nameless ones, buried where no one remembers. When I close my eyes, I can still see that morning after the fire, the smoke curling through the trees, the snow falling soft over the ruins, the silence that followed. We stood there, just a handful of men who were supposed to be dead, and watched the sun rise over a battlefield that no longer cared who had won. That's what I carry with me. Not the triumph, not the medals, just that moment, standing between what was lost and what somehow survived. If you've listened all the way to this point, then I want to thank you. Not for watching, not for hearing, but for remembering. Because that's all any of us ever really want. To be remembered as more than the noise we made before we disappeared. So if you're here, if this story found you somewhere tonight, do me a favor. Leave a like and subscribe. Not for me, but for them. The boys who never came home. The ghosts who still walk the woods when the wind turns cold. Keep them alive in your thoughts, just a little longer. Because forgetting, that's how wars really end.